A tattered leather bag, a woman of color, standing with unshakable poise, and the echoing, cruel laughter of a flight crew who thought they had her all figured out. In the sterile, impersonal world of airport terminals, they judged her by the scuffs on her satchel, not the steel in her spine. They saw a charity case, someone to be mocked in whispered jokes and disdainful glances. What they failed to realize was that their judgment, their petty display of power, was being silently recorded. They were about to learn that the man who signed their paychecks, the newly appointed CEO of Aerovista Airlines, called this woman his wife, and he was about to board the plane. The air in Chicago O'Hare's Terminal 3 was a familiar cocktail of stale recycled air, Cinnabon, and low-grade anxiety. Dr. Samantha James stood in the sprawling line for Flight 1107 to Los Angeles, a silent observer in a river of human hurry. She clutched the handle of her travel companion, a rich mahogany leather satchel. It wasn't a pristine brand-name bag from a glossy magazine. It was a vessel of her history. Its corners were softened and scuffed from sliding under countless university desks. Its surface held the faint, ghostly outlines of coffee rings from late-night writing sessions, and its brass clasps had been worn smooth by a decade of her fingers. To Samantha, the bag smelled faintly of old books and peppermint tea, a scent of comfort and perseverance. To the world, however, it seemed to be a different story. Her place in the priority boarding line, a perk of her husband's frequent travel, had already earned her a few sideways glances. She was a black woman, in a simple, elegant navy blue travel suit, her hair styled in intricate locks, adorned with a few silver cuffs. She projected an aura of quiet confidence that seemed to irritate those who expected something else. The first ripple of trouble began with the gate agent, a woman whose name tag read Cynthia. Cynthia had a pinched face and eyes that perpetually scanned for infractions. She eyed Samantha's approach, her gaze dropping immediately from Samantha's face to the worn leather bag at her side. "Ma'am," Cynthia said, her voice a flat, nasal monotone. "I'm going to need to see that bag in the sizer." Samantha smiled politely. "I can assure you it fits perfectly under the seat. It's done so hundreds of times." "It's policy," Cynthia clipped, gesturing with a pen towards the dreaded metal cage. "All personal items that appear oversized must be sized." The word appear hung in the air thick with insinuation. The bag was clearly not oversized. It was a standard satchel, far smaller than the bulky, overstuffed roller bags many other passengers were wrestling with. But Samantha understood the unwritten subtext. It wasn't about the bag's size, it was about her. She was being tested, singled out. Without a word, she walked to the sizer and slid the bag in. It dropped to the bottom, with several inches of clearance on all sides. She pulled it out and returned to the counter, her expression unchanged. Cynthia took her boarding pass without apology or acknowledgement, her lips pressed into a thin, unimpressed line. "Have a nice flight," she said, the words utterly devoid of meaning. As Samantha walked down the jet bridge, she heard a muffled snicker from behind. She glanced back to see Cynthia leaning towards a flight attendant, whispering something behind a cupped hand. The flight attendant, a woman with heavily lacquered blonde hair and a name tag that read Brenda, let out a sharp, derisive laugh. Brenda was the purser, the lead flight attendant for this flight, and she carried herself with the air of a monarch, surveying her tiny, pressurized kingdom. She saw Samantha and her bag, and her painted lips curled into a condescending smirk. She turned to her younger colleague, a fresh-faced man named Kyle. "Oh, bless her heart," Brenda drawled, her voice just loud enough to carry. "Looks like she's been carrying that thing since the Wright brothers. Did she win that in a raffle?" Kyle, eager to curry favor with the senior attendant, chimed in with a nervous titter. Right, I think my grandpa had one for his tools, probably full of rocks. Their laughter followed Samantha into the aircraft cabin. It was a specific kind of mockery designed to be overheard. It was a performance for each other, reinforcing their perceived superiority. It was cruel, unprofessional, and profoundly revealing. Samantha felt a familiar hot sting behind her eyes, but she willed it away. She was Dr. Samantha James, a sociologist whose entire career was built on studying and deconstructing these exact moments of prejudice and systemic bias. She had a PhD from the University of Chicago. The thesis that earned her that degree, a deep dive into toxic workplace cultures and the microaggressions that signal institutional rot, had been written with that very bag at her feet. The bag didn't hold rocks. It held the first edition copies of books she'd authored her research notes, and a small, smooth stone her husband had given her from a beach in Monterey, a reminder of their shared dreams. She found her seat 3A in the first-class cabin. As she slid her beloved bag under the seat in front of her, she felt the burn of Brenda's stare. The purser was standing at the front of the cabin, arms crossed, watching her with open disdain. The judgment was palpable. She doesn't belong here. A businessman in seat 3C, a portly man in a wrinkled suit, also noticed the exchange. He glanced at Samantha's bag, then at Brenda, a flicker of something amusement agreement in his eyes. He shifted slightly in his seat, angling himself away from Samantha, creating a small, invisible wall. Samantha took a deep breath, pulling out a book from her satchel. It was a collection of Stoic philosophy. She opened it to a dog-eared page, the words of Seneca, a balm to her spirit. It is not the man who has too little, but the man who craves more, that is poor. She knew her husband Roger would be the last one to board. It was his way. As the new CEO of Airlines, a legacy carrier hemorrhaging money and goodwill, he had a habit of flying incognito on his own planes, observing everything from the ground up. He called it management by walking around. Today's flight from the airline's main hub in Chicago to the critical market of Los Angeles was a particularly important test. He was flying under his own name, Roger Chen, but without his title listed. He wanted the raw, unfiltered experience of his customers. He had no idea he was about to get it. Brenda and Kyle continued their performance for the next 10 minutes as the rest of the first-class cabin filled. They were obsequious and fawning to the man in 3C, Mr. Henderson, a known tech executive. They offered him a pre-departure beverage with wide smiles, laughed a little too loudly at his weak jokes, and made a great show of taking his coat. When Brenda approached Samantha, her demeanor shifted instantly. The smile vanished, replaced by a clipped, formal tone. "Drink." "Water, please." "No ice," Samantha replied calmly. Brenda returned, placing the plastic cup on the tray with a distinct click, not a drop of the warmth she'd shown Mr. Henderson. She moved on her back, rigid. Samantha looked out the window, watching the ground crew scurry around the belly of the plane. She saw the baggage handlers tossing suitcases with practiced indifference and the fuel trucks connecting their long hoses. An airline was a massive, complex machine, and every single part, every human cog had to work in harmony. But she was witnessing firsthand how the human element, poisoned by prejudice and a toxic culture, could cause the entire machine to fail. Her husband had been hired to fix the balance sheets, to streamline operations, to negotiate with unions. But Samantha knew the problem at Aerovista was deeper. It was in the bones of the company. It was in the sneer of a gate agent, the cruel joke of a flight attendant. You could have the most efficient planes and the best routes in the world, but if your staff treated customers with contempt, you were destined to fail. This trip was supposed to be a quiet, fact-finding mission for both of them, Roger. observing the operational logistics, and she observing the human dynamics, the corporate culture in its natural habitat. She was in fact acting as an unpaid, unofficial consultant on the very issue she was now the victim of. The irony was as heavy as the silence from the seat next to her, which remained empty. The final boarding call was announced. The cabin door was about to be closed. Brenda stood at the front, clipboard in hand, looking impatient. "Looks like we have one empty seat," she said to Kyle, loud enough for the cabin to hear. "Maybe Mr. Chen is a no-show. A shame we could have taken off 10 minutes ago." She glanced pointedly towards Samantha, as if the delay were somehow connected to her. Just then, a man appeared at the aircraft door. He was of medium height, with sharp, intelligent eyes, and a calm, commanding presence that seemed to fill the space around him. He was dressed in a simple but well-tailored grey suit. It was Roger Chen. He nodded to the flight attendants at the door and began walking down the aisle. Brenda's eyes widened in recognition. She had seen his picture in the company-wide email memo announcing his appointment a month ago. This wasn't just some passenger named Chen. This was the Chen, the new boss. Panic flared in her eyes. She quickly composed herself, forcing a brilliant, sycophantic smile. "Mr. Chen, welcome aboard. We are so honored to have you flying with us today. My name is Brenda, and I'm your purser. Can I get you anything at all?" Roger offered a polite, neutral smile. "Thank you, Brenda. Just getting settled for now." He continued down the aisle, his eyes scanning the cabin, taking in every detail. He stopped at row 3. He looked at Samantha, and for the first time, a genuine warmth entered his expression. A silent conversation passed between them, a flash of concern from him, a reassuring calm from her. He turned to Mr. Henderson in 3C. "Excuse me," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "I believe that's my seat." Mr. Henderson looked flustered. "What?" "No, my boarding pass says 3C. Roger gestured to the empty seat 3B between Henderson and Samantha. "My apologies, you're correct. I'm in 3B. He then looked at Samantha, and the entire cabin seemed to hold its breath as he leaned down. He kissed her softly on the forehead. "Sorry I'm late, sweetheart," he murmured, his voice full of affection. "Last-minute call with the board." He then did something that made Brenda's blood run cold. He reached into his jacket, pulled out his company ID lanyard, and casually looped it around his neck. The badge flipped forward for everyone to see. In bold, clear letters under his name, it read, Chief Executive Officer. Roger Chen settled into his seat, took his wife's hand, and gave it a gentle squeeze. He looked across the aisle, his gaze landing directly on Brenda, who stood frozen near the galley. His expression was no longer neutral. It was sharp, analytical, and deeply, deeply disappointed. The flight to Los Angeles had just begun, but for Brenda and her crew, it was already over. The click of Roger Chen's seatbelt fastening was the loudest sound in the suddenly tomb-like first-class cabin. The air, once filled with the smug confidence of the flight crew, was now thick with a suffocating tension. Brenda stood paralyzed, her practiced smile frozen into a grotesque mask of horror. Her mind was a frantic scramble, replaying the last 20 minutes in excruciating detail, Cynthia's sneer, the mockery on the jet bridge, her own dismissive coldness. The woman with the charity case bag was not just a passenger. She was the CEO's wife. And Brenda had just made herself the star of a career-ending drama. Kyle, who had been bustling in the galley, peeked his head out, wondering at the sudden silence. He saw Brenda's face the color of chalk and followed her terrified gaze to row 3. He saw the CEO, Roger Chen, holding hands with the woman they had ridiculed. Kyle felt a wave of nausea and quickly ducked back into the galley, his heart hammering against his ribs. Across the aisle, Mr. Henderson, the tech executive, was performing a masterclass in social contortion. He cleared his throat, straightened his tie, and attempted a friendly, booming laugh. "Well, what a small world, Mr. Chen. A pleasure to meet you. Frank Henderson, H-Tech Solutions." He extended a hand across the empty seat. Roger shook it briefly, his focus unwavering. "Mr. Henderson." His tone was polite, but gave no quarter. He then turned his full attention back to his wife. "Are you all right?" he asked her softly, his thumb gently stroking the back of her hand. His eyes searched hers for any sign of distress. Samantha gave him a small, genuine smile. "I'm fine, Roger. Truly." She held his gaze, communicating everything he needed to know without a word. "Yes, it was exactly as we feared. But I'm okay. Watch. Listen. This is what you came to see." Roger understood. This was no longer just a personal insult. It was data. It was Exhibit A in the case for radical change at Aero Vista. He leaned back in his seat, his demeanor calm and observant, but his mind was a whirlwind of activity. The incident with his wife wasn't an isolated event. It was a symptom of a pervasive disease. The memos he'd read about declining customer satisfaction scores and plummeting employee morale were no longer abstract figures on a spreadsheet. They had a face. They had the face of Brenda, whose arrogance had curdled into fear. The cabin door closed, and the safety demonstration began. Brenda on autopilot went through the motions. Her voice, usually so full of false bonhomie, was now a strained, robotic monotone. She stumbled over the words, her eyes darting nervously towards row 3 every few seconds. Kyle was even worse. When it was his turn to demonstrate the oxygen mask, his hands trembled so violently he nearly dropped it. The entire performance was a farce, and every passenger in the premium cabin knew why. As the plane began its taxi to the runway, Samantha finally spoke to Roger in a low voice. It started at the gate. Agent's name was Cynthia. She insisted the bag be sized. It was performative. Roger nodded slowly, logging the name. Cynthia. Noted. Then the purser, Brenda, and the younger one, Kyle, on the jet bridge, joking about the bag, how it looked like it was from a thrift store. Roger's jaw tightened. He looked down at the worn leather satchel, tucked safely under his wife's feet. He knew its story. Samantha had bought it with the first real paycheck she'd ever earned from a teaching assistant position. He remembered her excitement, how she'd called it her scholar's satchel. It had been with her through every academic triumph, every late-night struggle. It was a symbol of her grit, her intellect, her entire journey, and his employees had treated it, and by extension, her like garbage. The service reflected it. Samantha continued her voice, the calm, detached tone of a researcher presenting findings. "Mr. Henderson was fawned over. I was given a plastic cup of water with a thud. I saw," Roger said, his voice grim. "I saw the end of it." The plane took off, climbing steeply over the sprawling grid of suburban Chicago. Below them, the world was orderly and distant. Inside the cabin, however, chaos was brewing. In the galley, Brenda grabbed Kyle by the arm, her nails digging into his sleeve. "What do we do?" she hissed, her voice trembling. "What do we do? I don't know." Kyle stammered, his face pale. "We're fired. We're so fired. My career is over before it even started." "Shut up, don't be so dramatic," Brenda snapped, though her own panic was escalating. A primal instinct for self-preservation kicked in. She had to fix this. She had to grovel, apologize, do whatever it took to salvage the situation. She smoothed her uniform, took a deep breath, and prepared to launch a desperate charm offensive. She re-emerged from the galley, a tray in hand with 2 glasses of champagne and a small plate of gourmet chocolates. She approached row 3 with a smile so wide it looked painful. "Mr. Chen, Dr. James." She began, her voice an octave higher than usual. "On behalf of the entire crew, I am so terribly sorry for the confusion earlier. A little gift from us to celebrate having you on board. We are just so thrilled." Samantha looked at the champagne and then up at Brenda, her expression unreadable. Roger didn't even glance at the tray. He looked directly at Brenda, his eyes cold. "Brenda," he said, his voice level. "My wife asked for water. Is that what this is?" The question hung in the air, a surgical strike. He wasn't just rejecting the champagne, he was rejecting her entire transparent attempt at a cover-up. He was holding her to the standard of her job, a standard she had failed. Brenda's smile faltered. No, sir, this is champagne. I just thought—" "You thought wrong," Roger said, cutting her off. "Right now, I'd like you to please focus on providing the same level of service to all passengers in this cabin. Nothing more, nothing less. Is that clear?" "Yes, sir. Crystal clear," Brenda mumbled. Humiliated, she retreated to the galley with her tray of peace offerings. The grovelling strategy had backfired spectacularly. Now there was only dread. But for Roger, the issue was rapidly expanding beyond poor customer service. As a CEO new to the industry, brought in from a tech background to disrupt and rebuild, he was looking at everything with fresh eyes. His predecessor had been an airline lifer, a man who likely saw employees like Brenda as fixtures, part of the old guard. Roger saw them as liabilities. During the flight, he watched everything. He noticed the slow response to a call button from a passenger in the back of the cabin. He saw Kyle spill a drink on a passenger and offer only a flimsy apology with a handful of paper napkins. He noted the disinterested, sullen expressions on the faces of the other crew members as they served the meal. It was a systemic failure. The rot went deep, and then he noticed something else, something stranger. About 2 hours into the flight, Brenda began making frequent hurried trips to the cockpit. This was not entirely unusual, but her demeanor was furtive. She would carry a tablet with her, but hold it close to her chest, angled away from any passengers. On one of her return trips, Roger saw the pilot, Captain Miller, a veteran with a stern reputation, give Brenda a sharp, almost angry look as she exited. Then came the detail that set off every alarm in Roger's head. Brenda was talking quietly with Kyle in the galley, but they fell silent as soon as another flight attendant approached. Roger saw Brenda discreetly pass a small folded piece of paper to Kyle. Kyle palmed it, and a few minutes later, on his way to the lavatory at the rear of the plane, he accidentally dropped a napkin next to a passenger in seat 24B, a large, rough-looking man who had kept his head down the entire flight. As Kyle bent to pick it up, Roger, craning his neck just enough to see, witnessed a subtle handoff. The man in 24B slipped the folded paper into his pocket without a word. Roger's mind, honed by years of analyzing systems and spotting anomalies, in data went into overdrive. This wasn't bad service. This was something coordinated, something illicit. He turned to Samantha and spoke in a near whisper. "Sarah, I need you to do me a favor. When the flight attendant passes, ask for the purser by name. Say you have a question about the special cargo manifest." Samantha's eyes widened slightly, but she nodded, understanding immediately that he had seen something far more sinister than rudeness. Special cargo manifest. Got it. A few minutes later, Kyle walked past their row. Samantha stopped him politely. "Excuse me, Kyle. Could I possibly speak with Brenda? I just had a quick question about the special cargo manifest for this flight." Kyle's face went from pale to ghostly white. His eyes bulged with sheer panic. The what?" he stammered, looking around wildly as if searching for an escape route. I don't know what you're talking about. We don't have that. I'll get Brenda." He practically fled to the galley. A moment later, Brenda appeared, her face a thunderous mask. The fear was gone, replaced by a defensive fury. "Can I help you?" She snapped, her voice low and dangerous. "My wife had a question," Roger said, taking over. His voice was glacial. "About the special cargo manifest." Brenda's eyes darted between Roger and Samantha. She licked her lips, her mind racing. "That's a secure document. It's not for public discussion. I don't know why you're asking about it." "I'm asking," Roger said, leaning forward slightly, "because I'm the CEO of this airline, and a special cargo manifest of the type you seem to be familiar with doesn't officially exist. I'm also asking because I'm seeing behavior from you, your crew, and at least one passenger on this flight that suggests something is deeply wrong. And I promise you, by the time this plane touches down in Los Angeles, I will find out exactly what it is." The threat was no longer about being fired. It had escalated into something far more serious. Brenda stared at him, her bravado crumbling, revealing the raw, cornered animal fear beneath. She knew that her terrible judgment about Samantha's bag was now the least of her problems. She had been caught in a web of her own making, and the man who held all the strings was sitting in seat 3B. The rest of the flight to LAX would be the longest 2 hours of her life. The familiar bump and rumble of the landing gear touching down at LAX was a sound that usually brought Brenda Walsh a sense of relief and satisfaction. It signaled the end of another flight, another successful exercise of her authority in her small airborne kingdom. Today, however, the sound was a death knell. Throughout the tense, silent descent over the sprawling lights of Los Angeles, she had been locked in a state of churning dread. Every glance from Roger Chen felt like a physical blow. Every moment of his quiet conversation with his wife felt like another nail being hammered into her coffin. Kyle had been a wreck hiding in the galley, his face pale and clammy. The professional veneer of the flight crew had been sandblasted away, revealing the raw panic beneath. As the aircraft slowed on the runway, Roger Chen was already on his phone, his voice a low, steady current of command that was utterly at odds with the passenger he had pretended to be. "David, it's Roger. We're on the ground at T4 Gate 72A. The plan is active." He said, his eyes fixed on the back of Brenda's head as she prepared for the arrival announcement. "I want the manifest for Flight 1107 from O'Hare cross-referenced for passengers with prior watch list flags. Specifically check the name Gus Sokolov, seat 24B. He is to be met by Port Authority and escorted to a separate interrogation room." "Understood." There was a pause. "Good. The entire flight crew, pilots, attendants. Everyone is to be intercepted at the jet bridge exit. No exceptions. Escort them directly to corporate briefing room 21B. No comms. Confiscate their company devices upon entry. I want them isolated from each other and from their union reps until I arrive. This is an asset protection, priority 1. But your teams are to maintain absolute discretion. No scenes. Just quiet, professional gravity. I'll be there in 10 minutes with Dr. James." He ended the call and slipped the phone back into his pocket. He gave Samantha's hand a reassuring squeeze. His expression was grim but resolute. The time for observation was over. The time for reckoning had begun. Brenda, forcing her voice into a semblance of normalcy, delivered the arrival speech. As the plane docked and the seatbelt sign pinged off, a desperate, foolish hope sparked within her. Maybe it would just be a reprimand, a formal write-up. Maybe she could explain it away, apologize profusely, salvage this. She positioned herself at the door, her professional smile plastered on like a cheap mask, ready to bid farewell to the man who held her future in his hands. Roger and Samantha were among the first to deplane. He didn't even look at Brenda as he passed his focus entirely on his wife. That utter dismissal was more terrifying than any overt display of anger. Brenda's hope disintegrated the moment she stepped onto the jet bridge. Waiting there just past the aircraft door were not the usual cheerful ground staff, but 2 uniformed Port Authority officers and a stern man in a dark suit whose face was an unreadable mask of corporate authority. It was David Peterson. Ms. Brenda Walsh. David said, his voice leaving no room for argument. "Please come with us." Her blood ran cold. "There must be some mistake," she began, her voice trembling. "I have post-flight duties to attend to." "Your duties have been reassigned," David cut in smoothly. "This way, please." She had no choice but to comply. As she was led away, she saw the rest of her crew being similarly intercepted. Captain Miller was protesting loudly, his face flushed with indignation, but he too was silenced by a quiet word from another of David's agents. Then she saw Kyle. He wasn't even trying to argue. He was openly weeping, his shoulders shaking as 2 officers flanked him. Further down the concourse, she caught a glimpse of the hulking passenger from 24B, Gus Sokolov, being guided in a different direction, his face sullen and resigned. This wasn't a disciplinary meeting. This was a purge. The walk to room 21B was a silent journey through the sterile back corridors of the airport, a world away from the bustling terminals. They passed other flight crews laughing and sharing stories, their faces alight with the freedom of a completed trip. The contrast was a blade twisting in Brenda's gut. Corporate briefing room 21B was as cold and unforgiving as its name suggested. It was a windowless box of grey walls, polished concrete floors, and a massive, intimidating mahogany table. The air was chilled, smelling of industrial cleaner and quiet dread. The rest of her crew was already there, seated in chairs spaced far apart, a study in collective fear. At the head of the table sat Roger Chen and Samantha James. Samantha's posture was one of academic repose, a notebook open before her, as if she were about to attend a lecture. Her calm was the most unnerving thing in the room. Flanking them were David Peterson and a severe-looking woman Brenda recognized as Eleanor Vance, the West Coast head of human resources. They were the judge, the jury, and the executioners. Roger waited until the door clicked shut, the sound sealing them in. He stood up slowly, his movements deliberate. The simple grey suit he wore now seemed like armor, his quiet demeanor a cloak for immense power. "Good afternoon," he began, the words dropping into the thick silence. "I want to start by talking about the future of Aerovista. I was brought here 34 days ago to chart a new course for this airline, to restore its reputation, to rebuild public trust, and to create a culture where our employees feel proud to work and our customers feel valued and respected." He let that sink in his eyes, moving from one terrified face to another. "I have spent the last month reviewing financial data, operational reports, and market analysis. But today I decided to collect my data firsthand. Today I, along with my wife, Dr. Samantha James, experienced Aerovista Airlines not as its CEO but as a customer." He paused, his gaze hardening as it settled on Brenda. "And what we experienced has convinced me that our problems are not on spreadsheets. They are in our hallways. They are on our jet bridges. They are in our cabins." He picked up a log sheet. "Our experience began at O'Hare with a gate agent named Cynthia Peters, who decided my wife's bag, and by extension, my wife herself, required a baseless and humiliating public inspection. It then continued with purser Brenda Walsh and flight attendant Kyle Bishop, who felt it was acceptable to mock that same passenger, to laugh at her belongings, in a cruel and unprofessional display. Kyle let out a choked sob, burying his face in his hands. Brenda stared straight ahead, her face pale but defiant, a final futile effort to maintain her dignity. "This behavior," Roger said, his voice dropping to a dangerously low pitch, "this casual systemic bigotry is a cancer. It is wholly unacceptable, and it is grounds for immediate termination." He looked at the HR head. "Eleanor, please process the paperwork for Ms. Peters, Ms. Walsh, and Mr. Bishop." A collective gasp went through the room, but Roger raised a hand, stopping any further reaction. "But I'm afraid," he continued, the softness of his voice making the words land with even more force, "for some of you, your employment status is the least of your concerns today. You see, your appalling customer service, as it turns out, was merely the clumsy cover for a far more ambitious enterprise." He nodded to David Peterson. David stood and tapped a remote. A large screen on the wall flickered to life, showing a schematic of the O'Hare cargo facility. "For 6 months," David began in a clinical monotone, "a joint task force between Aerovista Asset Protection and the FBI has been investigating a sophisticated theft ring, high-value untraceable electronics being systematically stolen from secure cargo and transported on passenger flights." He clicked the remote. A grainy security video played on the screen, a silent clip of Brenda talking animatedly, with 2 known-to-be corrupt baggage handlers next to a very specific cargo container. Brenda's breath hitched. "The thieves used a brilliant method," David went on. "They'd mark a designated food service trolley as empty for maintenance, use it to transport the stolen goods from the cargo bay to the galley bypassing all standard checks. The lead flight attendant on board would then receive the drop-off information via a coded message disguised as a manifest update on their company tablet. The only thing we were missing was the identity of the purser at the center of the ring, the one coordinating these flights." Roger stepped forward again. "And then by a stroke of fate you chose my wife's flight to make your move, and you chose to antagonize the one person on the plane who prompted me to look closer at everything you did." He locked eyes with Brenda. "So when my wife, at my request, asked about a special cargo manifest, a trigger phrase fed to an informant last week, the sheer unadulterated panic on Mr. Bishop's face was a confession. Your subsequent fury, Ms. Walsh, was the signature on that confession." Brenda finally snapped. "This is ludicrous of fantasy." She spat, finding a sliver of her old fire. "You have no proof I'm a 20-year veteran of this airline. This is a personal vendetta because I didn't recognize your wife. That man in 24B. I've never seen him before in my life." "Gus Sokolov," David said, calmly, without looking up from his notes. "He's in interview room 3 right now, giving a very detailed statement. He seems to believe that a young, crying flight attendant dropped a napkin in his lap containing an address for a warehouse in Van Nuys. He was promised a package of Neuralink processors, valued at over $500,000. He was very disappointed to learn his contact at the warehouse was an FBI SWAT team." David finally looked up. "He's given you up, Brenda. All of you. The entire network." The truth landed like a physical blow. It was over. Every lie, every angle was gone. The final dam of denial broke inside Kyle. He fell from his chair to his knees, his wails echoing in the cold room. "She made me do it," he screamed, pointing a trembling finger at Brenda. "I didn't want to. She said it was an unofficial bonus that everyone did it to get by. She said, if I didn't play along, she'd write me up for insubordination until I was fired. She gave me the note. I just had to drop it. Oh God, I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry." Brenda looked at the groveling boy she had so easily manipulated, a sneer of pure contempt on her face. But the sound of his confession was the sound of her cell door slamming shut. Captain Miller, his face ashen, spoke for the first time. "Mr. Chen," I swear on my children I had no idea. My 30 years of service. Brenda came to the cockpit, yes, but it was to complain about a difficult passenger in 3A. She was building a case against your wife I never suspected. Your flight records and testimony will be considered Captain, Roger said, cutting him off. He then turned his full final attention to Brenda Walsh. He walked around the table until he was standing directly in front of her. You know, Miss Walsh, your entire criminal enterprise collapsed because of one single fatal flaw, your prejudice, he said, his voice a quiet, devastating indictment. You looked at Dr. Samantha James. You saw a black woman with an old bag, and you wrote a story in your head. A story about her being poor, out of place, and most importantly, powerless. You felt so secure in your superiority, so certain of your judgment, that you became careless. He leaned in closer. That arrogance, that ugly, reflexive bigotry, is what blinded you. While you were busy looking down on her, you never once thought to look up. You never conceived that the world might be bigger than your narrow view of it. You never imagined that the woman you scorned could be connected to the man who owned the plane you were robbing. He straightened up and gave a slight nod to David. The door to the room opened, and 2 uniformed Port Authority officers stepped inside. Brenda Walsh, one of them said, his voice flat and official. You are under arrest. As they moved behind her to put her hands behind her back, the fight finally drained from Brenda's face, replaced by a hollow mask of shock. The cold click of the handcuffs fastening around her wrists was the only sound in the room. Her last desperate glance was towards Samantha, the woman whose quiet dignity had been the catalyst for her utter ruin. Samantha met her gaze, not with triumph or hatred, but with the quiet, profound sadness of a scholar observing a predictable, tragic human failing. Brenda Walsh, the self-proclaimed queen of the cabin, was led away, her head bowed, her silent tears tracing paths through her carefully applied makeup. The heavy door of room 21B clicked shut, leaving a silence that was not empty, but filled with the promise of a long overdue corporate cleansing. The silence that descended upon corporate briefing room 21B after Brenda Walsh and Kyle Bishop were led away was heavy and absolute. It was the sound of a paradigm shifting, of an old world ending. The remaining crew members, including the pilots, sat ramrod straight, avoiding eye contact with the man at the head of the table. They looked like school children, awaiting the judgment of a stern headmaster. Roger Chen finally broke the silence, his voice, now devoid of its earlier ice, replaced by a tone of weary gravity. Captain Miller, your flight logs and service record will be thoroughly reviewed by a team from my office, not just standard HR. If you are as clean as you claim, you will be a vital part of the solution going forward. The same applies to the rest of you. We need good people to rebuild. But be under no illusion, the era of complacency at Aerovista is over. You are all dismissed. They practically scrambled from the room, escaping into the fluorescent-lit hallway, leaving Roger and Samantha alone with David Peterson. David, Roger said, finally sinking into his chair and rubbing his temples. The federal case is yours now. I want daily updates, and I want the audit on Cynthia Peters at O'Hare expedited. I want to know how many other passengers she has subjected to that treatment. It's already in motion, Roger, David confirmed, gathering his files. We'll find the depth of the rot. He gave a respectful nod to Samantha. Dr. James, I'm sorry for what you endured today. Thank you, David, she replied quietly. But in a way, it was the most illuminating field research I've ever conducted. When David left, closing the heavy door behind him, Roger finally let out a long, ragged breath. He reached across the table and took his wife's hands. Sarah, I knew it was bad. The numbers, the reports, the anecdotes. but to see it directed at you, to see that look on her face. He trailed off, his jaw tight with a residual anger that was deeply personal. "It wasn't about me, Roger," she said softly, her calm a stark contrast to his simmering fury. "Not really. I was just a symbol. The bag was a symbol. To them we represented something that didn't fit their narrow, prejudiced worldview. That's the sickness you were hired to cure." Later that night, in their suite, at a hotel overlooking the Pacific, Roger stood by the window, watching the distant lights of planes descending into LAX. The PR team had already sent him a draft of an internal memo about the incident, a bland corporate speak document full of jargon about reaffirming our commitment to service excellence. He read it once and deleted it with a visceral stab of his finger. He sat down at the desk, pouring a glass of Macallan 18 that he didn't touch. He opened a blank document. This couldn't be sanitized. This had to be a scalpel. He began to type, not as a CEO, but as a man who had just watched his company fail his wife. He wrote about the pride an employee should feel and the shame he felt today. He detailed the corrosive nature of casual prejudice, how a single sneer can poison the well for everyone. He didn't name Samantha Brenda or Kyle, but he painted the scene with such clarity that its truth was undeniable. He finished with the line that had been echoing in his mind all evening. "We will rebuild this airline on a foundation of respect, or we won't have an airline at all." He hit send just before dawn. The memo landed in 80,000 inboxes like a shockwave. In a crew lounge in Denver, a veteran pilot read it, grunted in approval, and pinned it to the bulletin board. In a baggage claim office in Miami, a young agent who had often felt overlooked by the divas on the flight crews read it 3 times, a slow smile spreading across her face. The old guard grumbled about the new CEO being too soft, but for thousands of others it was a blast of fresh air, a sign that the silent frustrations of the frontline workers were finally being heard at the very top. The hard karma for the guilty parties was swift and uncompromising. The federal investigation into the theft ring dominated industry news for weeks. Brenda Walsh's carefully constructed image was publicly obliterated. Stripped of her uniform and arrogance, she became a haggard figure in a string of courtroom photos. The legal fees consumed her savings and her pension. Facing a mountain of evidence, and betrayed by her own criminal associates, she took a plea deal. Her sentence, 10 years in a federal prison, was a stark testament to the magnitude of her greed. She became a ghost story, told to new recruits a cautionary tale of how quickly a career could nosedive into ruin. Kyle Bishop's fate was less severe, but no less tragic. His public apology and full cooperation earned him probation, but his FAA license was permanently revoked. His dream of a life in the sky was grounded forever. A year later, a traveling Aerovista executive spotted him working at a rental car kiosk at the Phoenix airport. He was explaining insurance waiver policies with a defeated air, his eyes occasionally drifting upwards to watch the planes. He could no longer board a young man haunted by the consequences of his own weakness. Cynthia Peters, the gate agent who started it all, was called into a meeting with O'Hare's station manager and a corporate HR representative. She entered defiantly prepared to argue her case, but fell silent when they produced a file nearly 3 inches thick. It was a dossier of complaints against her stretching back 5 years, detailing a clear pattern of targeting minorities and non-traditional travelers for random checks and baseless accusations. Her termination was immediate and final. Roger knew that firings alone were not a solution. He needed a new blueprint for the company's soul, and he knew the only architect for the job. In their hotel suite, he turned to Samantha. "I need you, Sarah. Not as my wife, but as Dr. James. This isn't just a corporate problem. It's a sociological one. This is your life's work. It's a chance to put your theories into practice on a scale that could change an entire industry. After much consideration, she agreed. She designed a revolutionary new training program, one that eschewed corporate videos and trust falls. She called it The View from 3A. It was an immersive, empathy-driven curriculum. Employees were put through sophisticated simulations, experiencing the subtle and overt aggressions of being a singled-out passenger. They analyzed real anonymized case studies, including the core details of Samantha's own experience, to learn to identify their own unconscious biases. Samantha's old leather satchel became an unlikely corporate icon. Roger had it brought to the Aerovista headquarters in Chicago. There, in the gleaming, impersonal lobby, it was placed inside a simple glass case. It sat there, scuffed, and worn a stark contrast to the chrome and marble around it. The small brass plaque beneath it, personally written by Roger, became a touchstone for the company's new identity. Respect is the only baggage that matters. With this new cultural foundation being laid, Roger moved on the operational front. He cleaned house in the executive wing, replacing complacent vice presidents with innovative leaders who shared his vision. He funneled millions into new technologies, but more importantly, he invested in his people. He raised wages for all frontline staff, arguing to the board that a respected employee provides respectable service. He instituted a direct anonymous ethics hotline that went straight to a special team in his office, ensuring that no complaint would ever again be buried. A year to the day after the flight to LAX, Roger and Samantha boarded Flight 1107 again. They sat in 3A and 3B. The atmosphere was tangibly different. The crew was efficient, but also warm, engaging with passengers with an ease that couldn't be feigned. They saw the lead flight attendant kneel down to speak to a small child who was scared of flying, calming him with a quiet story and a plastic wings pin. The flight attendant who served their section, a bright-eyed woman named Maria, approached with a genuine smile. As Samantha shifted in her seat, Maria's eyes fell upon the mahogany satchel tucked by her feet. "Excuse me for saying," Maria said, her voice full of sincere curiosity, "but that is a beautiful satchel. It looks like it has a lot of great stories." Samantha looked at the bag, then at Roger, a slow, knowing smile gracing her lips. For a moment, she saw the ghost of Brenda's sneer, heard the echo of Kyle's laughter, felt the sting of that initial judgment. But it was distant now, replaced by this simple, human moment of appreciation. The journey had been long and arduous, a full-scale battle for the soul of a company. But in that one unsolicited comment, she heard the sound of victory. She looked up at Maria, her eyes shining with the weight of the past year. "More than you could possibly imagine," she replied. "This story is a powerful reminder that our actions, especially those born from snap judgments and prejudice, can have consequences that ripple far beyond what we can see." The flight crew of Aerovista 1107 thought they were just sharing a private joke at someone else's expense. They never imagined they were performing for an audience of one, the very man who held their careers in his hands. But this tale is about more than just satisfying karma. It's about the hidden depths in every person we meet. The woman with the old bag was a brilliant academic. The quiet man in the suit was a corporate titan. They teach us that true value is never on the surface. If you believe that respect is non-negotiable, and that karma sooner or later always finds its address, please hit that like button to show your support. Share this story with someone who needs to hear it, and make sure to subscribe to our channel for more true stories, where justice, integrity, and character finally get their moment in the spotlight. What would you have done in Samantha's shoes? Let us know in the comments below.